Okay, so welcome back to our second talk this morning, and it's a great treat to have the host of our summer school as our speaker today. Many of you have known Paul for some time. Some of you have just met him in the last week or two. You've probably by now found out lots of interesting things about Paul. For instance, that he loves to sing Johnny Cash songs. That he recently bought a Porsche to try and cope with his midlife crisis. Is it working? That he used to run Ironmans. I don't know when he last did one. But also the great thing about Paul is that he really likes to have intense discussions about science. And the first time I met Paul, I was in a European project, and we were having our review meeting, and we were fortunate enough to have Paul as one of our reviewers. And so I was sitting in the review meeting thinking that it was going okay until Paul started asking questions. But actually what he did was he showed up some of the weaknesses in the project, and it did actually improve the project to have those pointed out to us in such a clear way. And that was actually the point where I began to think, this is an interesting person, and I should like to get to know him better, and maybe even start to work with him. So I really enjoy working with Paul on WYSIWYG and also BCBT, and I'm just beginning to get used to his direct style. So of course, now is our opportunity to get back at Paul. Mm-hmm. So please interrupt him at any point with questions, and these can be really off topic if you like. Yeah. So just try to distract him by asking the most awkward questions you can, and that'll be the way to have a fantastic experience. Mm-hmm. So over to you, Paul.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Thank you for the nice introduction. And indeed, it's great because it's how long was this ago? This review? I mean, this is ages ago.
10 years.
Yeah, you were still young that time. Right? So what I want to talk about is dolphins, because I think dolphins are cool. If you want to learn to swim like a dolphin, you should buy the book Total Immersion. But so what I want to talk about is consciousness, and in some sense also my trajectory, why I think, also I want to convince you of the fact that consciousness is something we should all worry about. It's worth worrying about, okay? And also I believe that it is on our path. If we want to understand the brain, this is on our path, whether we like it or not, okay? And of course, you hear a lot of noise about consciousness, and consciousness is also the kind of topic that you can always bring up in any bar conversation at any level of drunkenness, and people can talk about it because, you know, it's like with some body parts, everybody has one, so everybody else has an opinion about consciousness. So, however, I think there's a serious science to be developed of consciousness that we should try to attack. Okay. So this work is done with my members of the SPECS research group, who, as you know, can usually be found in the lab doing important things. This time I found them at some swimming pool somewhere in the Pyrenees. This was our rafting trip where they tried to get rid of me, but they failed, okay, because they didn't know I could swim, okay. So anyway, so all the work I'm talking about is also due to all these people in this collection, and you've met most of them by now. So it's not only on my shoulders, but of course everything that's wrong you can blame me, okay, and we can fight it out. That will be fun. So this is how the brain works, and it's called distributed adaptive control, and you guys have had some tutorials on this. And what I want to say with this at this point is just, look, we are looking at the brain from a theoretical perspective, like how does the brain work as an integrated system? This is our challenge. So not how does the brain work at the level of a single ion channel, or how does the brain work at the level of a single cell, right? I think then you're losing sight of the real challenge, right? The brain is this integrated system that works coherently. And in my opinion, the brain is organized along a number of layers. It's like a hierarchically structured control system. You have been looking at that in detail. So we have the body, we have reflexes that you might find in the brainstem. We have an adaptive layer, which is roughly matching to structures like the cerebellum, the amygdala. It helps you to develop a state space of states of the world and states of the agent. And then you link these acquired states together in goal-oriented plans using sequential memory systems. Then across these layers you have a columnar organization where you will have interlinked systems that process states of the world, I think culminating at the highest level in the episodic memory of the hippocampus. Then you have a columnar organization about systems linked together to process states of the self. And then lastly, we have a set of systems that are interlinked to control action. And in the end, action is the interaction between the world and the self. Yeah? So, in a nutshell, that is the idea of how DEC thinks about the brain as an integrated organization. And we're going to look at some details of this. So if you missed some bits at this point, don't worry about it. But how have we been investigating these systems? Well, it looks a bit like this. So we have looked a lot at foraging as a task, like how can I find targets in the world, and how can I survive, minimizing my damage that I cause to myself. And in this case, we just look at the density of positions visited of 2 robots that are driving around for 1 million time steps in an environment where we have targets in the corner, so these are food sources. And what you see, if you here compare a robot that just has the adaptive controller, so it can be classically conditioned, roughly. And here we compare this to a robot that can be also operantly conditioned, so it can acquire habits. You see that the habit-acquiring robot will structure its behavior more, and it will be having a more advanced or more optimized performance versus the robot that can only be classically conditioned. So these are the typical kind of tasks that we look at, and also you've been looking at, and then you can quantify behavior. And here already you start to see some advantages of doing this kind of embodied modeling work, because what I can do, which Aldo cannot do, I can measure over an almost infinite time window until you get bored, like 1 million time steps, every single pixel this robot samples. And then I can further start to quantify the variability of this input sampling. So that means building these robot-based models of the brain gives you also a tool to measure with greater control the dynamics of these systems, both in terms of their input sampling, their behavioral complexity, and the dynamics of their control structures. But we have to keep in mind, these are models. And a model of the brain is not the brain, right? But still. So these are the typical tasks that we deal with. And what we have already shown a long time ago is that this Bayesian model, or the DEC model of foraging, is optimal in a Bayesian sense. Now, in a Bayesian sense, as you know, it's right now very popular to talk about inference, the brain as an inference machine, the brain as a Bayesian optimizer. And all this essentially means is that you continuously apply all the knowledge you have to any situation you're in, okay? So what we have shown already a while back is that if you look at the basic equations of Bayesian decision making, where in the end the whole question is, okay, how do I optimize my actions or my goals through my actions? So then you have to say, okay, how do the observations that I make in the world match my hypotheses about this world? Right? So first you interpret the observations you make about the world in terms of the prior hypothesis you have about that world, and then given the validity of these hypotheses, you choose those actions that then optimize your goals. And we have shown that the dynamic equations of the DEC model are equivalent to the Bayesian description of the foraging task, however, under certain conditions only. Okay? And and these are the following. Yeah.
Where'd you get your priors?
The priors are learned by the adaptive layer. And the priors the learning by the adaptive layer is constrained by the reactive layer. Okay, so in the DEC architecture, I'm thrown into the world, and I don't know my name is Tony, right? I have to figure that out. But there are certain things I can do. I can breathe, I can make noise, right? I can already react to the world in a simple fashion that at least supports my survival. That's what my reactive layer does. But now what I also know, as soon as I, let's say, encounter a painful situation, I walk into the chair here, this unconditioned stimulus is also constrained, a piece of information for learning. So this is where now I start to label my world. I can say, okay, this object has a certain structure and it's painful. So now I'm acquiring my priors, and then those priors feed into my Bayesian optimization process.
So you're only optimal with respect to the experience that you've had. And
that's right.
And your behavior shapes your experience. So
yes.
It's a little bit circular in the sense of being...
Well, this is actually the point of this paper, where we identified this feedback loop, we call behavioral feedback, where we show your habits will start to constrain your priors, right? Because now if I have habits, let's say I like Johnny Cash, so I'm not all of Johnny Cash, but some of them. Okay. Imagine I like all of Johnny Cash, so I only listen to Johnny Cash. So then you could argue that my auditory perceptual systems are completely biased toward Johnny Cash songs. And my detection threshold for Johnny Cash songs really goes down a lot. I'm going to be hypersensitive. But now if I listen to, let's say, the Beatles, Tony knows the whole Beatles songbook by heart. I think it's the vacuum cleaner, right? I lost my sensitivity to the Beatles. So this is then behavioral feedback. And the claim we make here in this paper is that first, this bias exists. It's a non-neuronal behavioral feedback loop. That's again biased perceptual systems. And the brain therefore, has to include exploration mechanisms that allow you to break out of the constraining by behavioral feedback, okay? So, anyway, so DEC is Bayesian optimal, but it's only Bayesian optimal when our decision making is integrating across 4 different variables, okay? So basically, so what you look at here is an artistic rendering of the contextual layer of DEC made by Sietse. Thank you, Sietse, for confusing all of us. No, it's not. This is the clearest it ever got. Okay, so it's great. So the basic idea is, look, I'm running around in the world, and here I get these representations about the stuff I encounter and the actions I generate, and they're being thrown. You see actions and my predictions, on currents, my hypotheses on states of the world, and I feed those into a ring buffer, into a short-term memory system. Okay, so these are perceptual states and action states. But now, once I reach my goal, I find the beer in the fridge or whatever you consider your goal, okay? Then I grab this sequence that is in my memory and I store it in a long-term form, a long-term memory. So now I have my goal state and I have a sequence that hangs off the goal state of all the sensory motor pairs that brought me to that goal. And I conserve the order in which they occur. So this is now my long-term memory in which I have little strategies to solve certain problems in the world, okay? Now, if I want to optimally use these sequences, right, to generate action, so let's say I encounter the door of the kitchen and think, I'm halfway to the fridge where there's the beer. To do this in an optimal fashion, I have to assign a decision score to each element in my long-term memory that is accumulating 4 components, which is my perceptual evidence, like, is this really the kitchen door or is it the garage door? A memory bias, which means, well, if this is the kitchen door, then a few steps back, I should have been in the hallway, let's say. Then a goal, like, I like beer, okay? And then here I have value, which is, okay, does this element in this sensory motor pair in my long-term memory actually get me closer to the beer? Does it get me further away? Okay, or does it leads me to an obstacle, to punishment, to something negative? All right. So what we claim here, a while back already, so 2003, that for Bayesian optimal decision making to happen, and this is still considered in some sense the gold standard of decision making, given incomplete knowledge about a dynamic world, I have to have to assess values, the values of these 4 variables to make my decision score. Okay? So, however, if we now, then you say, oh, that's great. Then let's now, yes, please.
Can you go back 2 slides when you show this diagram? So here, every time you make a decision, you have to go through all your memories, right?
Yeah.
So that's not really Bayesian, because if it would be Bayesian, you would keep a statistic of it. Not, I mean, you would update your prior.
Mm-hmm.
Your prior would be. So every time you have a new memory, you would update your prior base. You know what I mean?
You continuously normalize across this set. Okay, you're continuously normalizing across the set of priors. All right, so let's say if I include new elements, I have to renormalize my probability distributions. So there's a normalization process going on here. And this is actually an important challenge. How do you do that?
But this normalization is done every time you do an action, or every time you update your memory?
Every time when you perform an action. Okay?
So that's not really Bayesian, as far as I...
No, look, every time I perform an action, I'm also consulting new memories, right? So when I reach a goal state, so I perform an action in terms of executing any of these sequences, I reach a goal state. Right? Now I succeeded or I failed. So I have a measurement of the world. And this gives me information that allows me to update my priors. Because maybe I figure out, oh, this hypothesis is actually unrelated to this goal now. So now I renormalize my probability distributions and I remove this prior. Alternatively, let's say I find a new route to the target. So I start to add new priors to the set. I also have to renormalize my probability distributions. Okay? So the key thing to keep it Bayesian is to assure the normalization, that you have your probability distributions continuously updated, and the update cycle of the priors here is always relative to the goals that you achieve.
But Paul, it's only approximately Bayesian, surely, because full Bayes is intractable, and you're not representing all the possible states.
Yes, so what we show on this paper is that the dynamic equations of the model are equivalent to the Bayesian description of foraging. But now you have to then say, okay, but how can I now in real time track all these states? So your implementation then becomes an approximation of that description. Yes, you're right. Okay? And that's why the normalization issue is so important. Because analytically, I mean, if in an analytical solution, that's easy to do, but in actually a real memory system that is physically instantiated to normalize across all the states is actually a difficult problem. Yeah?
So in all these slides, you say that this thing is Bayes optimal with respect to some cost function.
Yeah.
Does that have any possibility to incorporate other non-cost-based controls like, free energy or active inference, all these things?
The cost functions, in the example I gave here, the cost functions are priors to the system. So basically you say, look, I have a number of basic cost functions I have to optimize, which might be, let's say, hunger, thirst, reproduction, and so on. And that's it. Now, we have been looking at whether you can also map that to other kinds of cost functions that are more, let's say, cognitive cost functions, like something like a free energy cost function, like optimizing the way you predict states of the world. Okay? If we would believe that this is an important goal function that can be included, that's not the problem. Okay? For me, the challenge is more, should this be included, or should it be more, let's say, a global property of how the dynamics of the system works? Okay, so should it be explicitly encoded in the system, or should it be more a distributed property of multiple subsystems working together? That's a bit of a discussion item here, and that's why it's not included explicitly as a goal function. Yeah? But now if we then want to learn about how the brain makes decisions, and you don't talk to Aldo, right? But you just go to the literature and say, okay, what's the key literature here on decision making? How does it work? Yeah. Then you end up looking at these drift diffusion models that also we talked about a little bit yesterday in Ranulfo's talk. And in these models go back to psychology essentially. And the whole idea there is, look, if I have to make a decision, I accumulate evidence over time, right? So the world tells me something, like Tony looks at me and he looks very annoyed. So this is a piece of perceptual evidence that tells me that I said something wrong. Yeah. So So the whole idea is I integrate evidence until I reach the decision bound, and once I reach a decision bound, whichever of these options reach the decision bound first dictates the action we perform, and that's also why this is called like a horse race model. It's like every action that you could potentially perform is like a horse, and the speed of the horse is then defined by the evidence that the horse receives, and whichever horse reaches the finish first wins. Okay? These models are very simple, and also they looked actually very consistent with a neuronal substrate, because if you take a standard monkey task, like here you have a random motion display, the monkey is trained to make a saccade in the direction of the dominant movement of these dots in this display. So in this case the predominant movement is to the right, so the monkey has to make a saccade to the right. Then what was observed in first in the behavior is that there's a very strong correlation between the coherence of the motion and the performance of the monkey, the percentage correct that you get. But also if you go to areas like LIP, which sits really between, if you want, the visual processing areas of motion and the cortical frontal eye field that will initiate the saccade, then actually what you observe is that the firing rate of these cells, so the number here indicates the coherence of the moving dots, you see that the firing rate, the slope with which the rate of the neuron increases, is correlated with the coherence, with the perceptual evidence, right? So this led to the idea by Mike Shetland and Churchland and others and Newsom, and there's a whole sort of group of people around this, that actually this captures very well these drift diffusion models. And on those grounds, and the belief as well, drift diffusion is the explanation of how decision making really plays out in frontal areas. However, on top of that actually, and this, they wrote a paper, this sort of collection of people who are pushing decision making in the brain from this rate-based perspective, because in this case all that matters is the firing rate of neurons. They wrote a paper that actually went a step further, where they said, look, this was a 2013 paper, by Churchland and Shetland and other people, Newsom. It was really like a consensus statement of the community, where they said, well, the only thing that matters in neural processing for decision making, or in general for any function in the brain, is firing rate. And the variability we observe in a neural response is really irrelevant for function. It's a very strong statement, right? Because now suddenly anything that feeds into the variability of neural firing, which in the end might mean something like temporal coding, for instance, was declared fully irrelevant. Okay? And I think these kind of very categorical statements are dangerous and also problematic. And also going back to DAC, we said, well, does this really make sense? Because if I look at optimal decision making in the Bayesian perspective that we developed within DAC, I see that decision making depends on much more than perceptual evidence. I cannot be optimal if I only look at perceptual evidence, because I am acting also in the context of my memory. I have ambiguity in real world decision making. So I can resolve ambiguity because I have memory of my different strategies. And memory is not considered. So how can they be so categorical about the role of rate when memory is not even taken into account? So for that we hooked up with Stefano Farina, who's a colleague also of Aldo at La Sapienza in Rome. And Stefano has been elaborating a task that's called countermanding, that in a very precise way allows you to manipulate the error memory of a task. And this seemed to be a very good first approximation for us to get into this problem of how does memory now modulate decision making. So Stefano and his colleagues record in the premotor cortex, and the task the monkey has to perform is essentially, it has to learn to touch a dot on a go signal, which is either to the left or to the right on the screen. But then on some trials, the animal receives a stop signal. So it's told to interrupt the movement. Now, what you already can predict here, of course, if the stop signal delay is too long, you cannot recall that initiated movement anymore. So now you make an error. So this gives you a very clean way to control errors, right? So what we did now is we looked at a very specific property of the neural response, which is the variance of the conditional expectation. Why did we do that? Well, the variance of the conditional expectation is actually something very straightforward. It basically says, look, if I look at the firing neuron, like in this raster here we have a bunch of neurons that are responding once the monkey gets the go signal. There are actually two things working, two processes interacting, if you want. There's like a background firing rate. The neurons have a tendency for a certain level of spontaneous activity that's not dependent on the task. And then on top of that, there's a modulation of the variability in the firing that does depend on the task. So what I can do now is I can try to decouple the spontaneous state of the neuron from the task-induced variability. And then I just try to understand how is this variability now changing over different trials where I have different experimental conditions. So that's what we did. We're going to compare this now, this VarCE measure, the variance of the conditional expectation, to your standard rate-based interpretation of the neural firing. So first, if we look at the performance of the monkey, you can see here that if I have a go trial, so there's no stop signal presented, followed by another go trial, the monkey shows a rather low reaction time. So it's pretty fast, 470 milliseconds. If I have a stop trial that is followed by a go trial, so I just made an error, okay? You see that also, this is well known also from human psychophysics, the reaction time slows down. If I look now at the probability to make an error again, you also see that when I have a stop followed by a go trial, I become more accurate. So the error my error memory has made me slower, but also more accurate. While if I just have a go-go trial, the probability to make an error is higher, okay? So let's now see in these two conditions what the firing rate in the premotor cortex, dorsal premotor cortex tells us. Okay, so here we align the mean firing rate of 100 plus neurons in the premotor cortex to the go signal, and here we align them to the actual R movement. Okay, and you remember that the literature wants you to believe that the firing rate is actually strongly correlated with the performance. But now we know that in these two conditions, go-go and stop-go, the performance is very different. Right, I just showed you that. But you see, the firing rate is the same. Okay, so this shows you that the firing rate does not predict performance as soon as you bring in memory. Okay, so this shows that these rate-based drift diffusion models might be very effective when you work in a highly specialized restricted task, but as soon as you open it up to other variables that are relevant for decision making, they lose their effectivity. Now, if you look at this measure of intertrial variance, you see now if you compare the variance in the stop-go trial in red and a go-go trial, they're markedly different, and they're significantly different from each other. So in a trial where I just had an error, this intertrial variability is higher than in a trial where I had no error. And if we now match that to the performance, let me see. Okay, so the distinction, okay, here we see that, here we look at the correlation of our variability measure and the standard error of the reaction times in milliseconds and the mean reaction time. Okay, and you see there's a very strong correlation here between our variability measure and the performance as measured in the reaction time. Okay, and here we see also how the error as defined by the trial conditions, like 3 stop trials followed by a go trial, etc., is very strongly followed or correlated, tightly correlated with our variance measure. Okay, so in this case, what we show conclusively is that as soon as you bring in memory as a decision variable, rate is out of the window. It doesn't predict performance anymore. However, the variability now starts to become the significant predictor. So if you want, you can then make the prediction that this is more like your substrate on which decision making operates. So we have modeled this.
So Paul, it's a correlation. So you haven't shown causality.
That's why we go to the model. Okay. So the point is that, and this is also the step into consciousness, so pay close attention. No, how can you now account for the fact that the variability in an area of the prefrontal cortex would go up if I've made more errors? Okay. While in the meantime, I'm slowing down in my decision making and I become more accurate. Okay, how do you account for that? So we looked at standard models people have proposed, like Zhaoji Wang and Gustavo Deco. Also, Gustavo was a co-author on the paper, of decision making in prefrontal areas. And generally the model, that's basically the two red circles here and the blue one, says, look, for every action that you want to consider, you have an excitatory pool of neurons that in this case is go and stop, that are competing over an inhibitory pool of neurons. Okay? And they receive their perceptual evidence, lambda, that provides an excitatory drive on these populations, and then they follow an attractor dynamic. That means I have two excitatory pools, they are competing over inhibition, so one of the two will win that competition, and that's the pool that then will dominate the neural response. But what we propose now is that in order to account for the data in this countermanding task, I have to start to include a monitoring system. And this monitoring system integrates my errors, or if you could interpret this as a confidence measure. How confident am I about my performance? How many errors did I make? And what we propose here is that what this monitoring system really does, it sets the gain on this inhibition. That means if I'm not so sure about what I'm doing, I lower the inhibition, so I allow the excitatory pools to accumulate information longer and to fight it out longer. I will anneal to my solution more slowly. All right? Well, if I'm very certain about what I'm up to, then I crank up my inhibition so I more rapidly fall into one attractor or the other. Okay, so it's a very simple, I now modulate the competition in my decision-making network dependent on my error, my memory of my error history. So then what we show with the model is that this can exactly account for the variance that we observe in the data while displaying all the other physiological signatures. So this is now, so the message now is twofold. On the one hand, if we think about these complex tasks like decision making, we should be careful not to reduce them too much into, let's say, a sole perceptual decision making task. The DEC model predicted at least 4 other decision variables we must consider, and we included now one more, memory. Okay? And this gave us mileage to understand better the decision making going on in a countermanding task in prefrontal cortex. But what it also pointed to is the role of monitoring systems. That means even though these kinds of competitions are thought to play out in frontal areas of the cortex, which are pretty high up in this processing hierarchy, they themselves are not running the show autonomously. They, again, in turn, are monitored. So now, what kinds of monitoring do we have to distinguish? And how do different levels of monitoring and error correction vary dependent on the task domain that you're in? And it's from this perspective that I look at consciousness. That's what I will now explain to you.
Paul,
yes.
The students aren't interrupting you enough, so I'm having to do all the work.
Yeah, I know, it's just like this, very annoying. But that's what young people like. No, but I think you have to read their Twitter feeds, because probably they type that little shit, they type in their Twitter feed, and they don't tell you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the question is, once you allow a monitoring system,
Yeah.
then you could build the model with rate-coded neurons again. Doesn't have to be spiked, because you've added a new component.
Yes, but still the point is your rate as such is not predicting your performance anymore, right? And now, of course, there's a question, how do I read it out? And indeed, it's still the case that at some point I fall into one attractor or the other, and in that short window, this short time window, my spikes, my firing rate, will indeed inform the action I will execute. There, you're right. But the big difference now is that in a drift diffusion model, it's always about long integration time windows. And you say, okay, I just accumulate, and the slope of accumulation tells you what you're going to do. And those time windows don't appear to be relevant now, because those are the high variability time windows.
So is there a claim that the monitoring system is looking at the variability? And
Yes, it is looking at the variability. This is one of its inputs. It also looks at task performance, errors that you get. Right? And it will then take variability as an indirect measure of whether this whole competitive system is converging to any solution or not. Right? If variability stays high, it means you're not converging to a solution. So that could inform, for instance, to give up. It's another model that we're working on now with Encarni and Aldo in secret, so we don't talk to anyone about it. But it's really cool. Okay. But don't forget, right? I'm not making a claim that neurons don't spike or that spikes are not integrated. I'm definitely. But what I am saying is, look, but we should be really careful with these categorical claims. That's all rates. Okay, because the way this has panned out and in these long time integration time windows, this doesn't really seem to hold if we want to explain performance here in neural terms. Okay. So back to consciousness. So now we're looking at consciousness from the perspective of monitoring. This is my hypothesis. Okay, and I'm going to make this highly plausible to you, and then I'm going to make some predictions, and we're going to run experiments, and I'm going to show you it's all true. Okay. So.
What is the icon doing in that picture?
It's being abducted by aliens. Okay. This is expressing the mental life of the ICAP. Okay.
Sorry, Paul, can we go back to the previous slide, please?
This one?
No, the one before this.
Yeah.
So this is a super naive question, but how do you know which attractor you fall into? Is that still the variability?
Well, think about it like this. So you have these look, Tony and I are shouting at each other, okay, through a microphone, and you're at the mixing panel, okay. And I say, I really don't like what Tony's saying, so you just pull down the gain on Tony,
Right.
and I win.
But now, is this the rate or the variability?
No, both work together if you want. So the variability is measured as, let's say, you just look at the interspike intervals, for instance. This is a measure of your variability, and you compare these, you do some statistics on that, and you compare these between trials. Okay? So this is variability. The rate is you sum the spikes. Right? So it's a different statistic of the same spike train.
Right.
Okay? So the variability in this case just means, look, if Tony and I are fighting it out, and you measure the sound pressure waves, there will be a lot of, you can just accumulate the amplitude, or you can look at, let's say, some sort of frequency modulation of the sound wave. Okay? So this is the difference. It's a different statistic of the same signal.
I see.
And the point is, the longer the competition lasts, if you just measure that whole population, you will see, okay, it's fluctuating more when the competition doesn't settle, because it's the inhibition that's the big equalizer.
Right.
Yeah?
So increased inhibition, fewer.
Less variability, exactly, because it's like you immediately pulling down the gain on Tony, which I would do as well. Right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah?
Okay, that makes
Okay.
sense.
So both your attractors are working on the inhibition, right?
Yes,
So
of course.
it's like it's probably more like you are pulling the gain on Tony's mic and he's pulling the gain on your mic.
Yeah, but then there's still a mediator in between, right? So it's more that Tony tells the mixing panel person, don't do this, don't fade me out. And the mixing person says, forget it, I'm going to fade you out. Okay? Yeah? But yes, you're right. There's a recurrent interaction there, yes.
Wasn't it the job of the monitor system cranking up the inhibition?
Yeah,
So you're missing some errors.
yeah, I know. You're right. But look, the different ways to implement this, because the monitoring system, because there's a recurrent excitation, can also just pump excitation into these pools. But it comes down to the same thing. You're biasing the competition. Okay?
But then it's not through inhibition.
Huh?
But then it's not through inhibition, it's through.
Well, the different variations of this model. No, wait, but this is the decisive factor. How long do you allow this inhibition to run? Okay, this is the key decisive factor. Right? Do you allow this inhibition to act with a very strong gain on these two pools or with a low gain? Okay. So what's the function of the brain? You've been listening to lots of people the last week. So who has an answer? Everything. Okay.
5HW.
Exactly. H5W, Tony. Why do you get it right? So going back to Pavlov, we can say that the brain maintains an equilibrium between the organism and its environment, right? And also Claude Bernard made a similar claim in the 19th century. It's also it's interesting to see that already Pavlov is having these intuitions about homeostasis between organisms and their environment. But now the brain can only equilibrate between the two by generating action, right? So the key thing about brains is to generate action. But then we have to answer the question, what does it take to act? And I'm just make the claim that the brain, when it interacts with the physical world, has to optimize 4 objective functions, which is why, what, where, and when. So what's my motivation to act? What are my goals? What are the objects of my desire that pertain to these goals? Where am I and how is the world structured? So there's my self-localization and mapping problem. And when? How do I adjust my actions in time in order to satisfy my goals, taking into account these constraints? So that's cool. So here we have a rat solving H4W, and the DEC model that we have exercised so far that you saw earlier is also solving H4W. So you have a rat that is hungry, so it cruises around in the shuttle box. It goes home when the food pellets are large. That means it knows the objects, food pellets, it knows the spatial layout of the task, and also it doesn't bump into these corners too much, so it's adjusting its actions in time to its own velocity and the structure of the environment. So this is H4W in a nutshell, and I think your whole life, when you're only dealing with the physical world, is structured along H4W. There's nothing else your brain worries about. But now, so it generates action in the physical world by solving H4W, but then something else happened in evolution, that in the Cambrian explosion, so about 560 million years ago, the number of life forms, so this graph represents sort of the fossil record of the life forms on planet Earth, rapidly increased. And I think this had a very major impact on how brains were organized, because suddenly we had to worry about who, not the rock group, the Who, but other agents, although Tony knows lots of Who songs as well. So this is a qualitative change in how we have to control behavior. Now, why is that? So this now leads to H5W, and in my opinion, H6W doesn't exist. So this is the H5W problem. Here we have all these agents, so that's all of you in the room, optimizing your own H4W, like, yes?
Quick question. Can you go back to the previous slide? So is it that the Coma explosion made brains aware of the 5th W, or was it the other way around? Because because animals started kind of forming groups that made the explosion.
I think you're trying to set up a chicken and egg problem, but the chicken and egg problem has been solved. But I cannot tell you the answer. But I will tell you later after you sang your song at the dinner, okay? And it's about the chicken and egg having sex, but okay, that's something else. So the point is that my claim is that at this point there was an invention in evolution, and this was the invention that gave brains the ability to track other agents. And that then facilitated the Cambrian explosion. Otherwise, it would have been dampened out immediately. That's my claim. Okay? So this is the problem. Here we have all these agents. You guys in the room, you'll think like, I have to update my Facebook page. I didn't upload anything to Instagram and whatever. My friends don't know what I'm doing, but they're not your real friends, they're just people on Facebook. Okay. So this is what you're worried about, but you're not advertising this to me, except when you're typing on your phone. So, so the problem I'm having now is that I have to make inferences about these internal states, whether you like more chocolate croissants or whether you want to have lunch, whatever. You're not advertising this to me. So I have a massive inference problem here, okay? The world has really changed. You are not like a bunch of rocks or bricks that advertise their internal states explicitly to the outside world, okay? You have hidden states that are not advertised to me. This is the big problem of having other agents in your environment, okay? And I'm saying that this problem, with this pervasive intentionality in the world suddenly after the Cambrian, was the driver or required consciousness to be solved. It required a new level of monitoring, okay, that the brain thus far did not have to solve. So the who are part of it. So the brain generates action, solves H4W in the physical world. So in most experiments we see, except the really cool ones at the end from Aldo, where you have social interaction with the macaque and other agents. But most experiments play out in H4W land, right? So they optimize only 4 objective functions. Well, I think most of these brains are really geared towards solving H5W. So we might have also, again, a very limited view on that. Even all these young people are reshaping their brain to only deal with H4W because they don't know what physical agents are anymore.
So what's the minimal requirement for who? Do you have to recognize individuals?
The minimum requirement for, well, the minimum required for who is movement. Okay. For us, in the case of humans, some anthropomorphic features, we will be sensitive to that, but essentially movement, unpredictable movement, I think is the minimum requirement.
But you mean you just recognize anything else that's not inanimate as being an entity? Or an agent?
Well, actually, I'll show an example of this later. I claim that prior in the mammalian brain, the vertebrate brain, maybe even before, they even go down to bees if you want. If stuff moves, you first ascribe intentionality to it as a prior, okay? And then through exploration, you might figure out that this was an excessive ascription, then you suppress it, okay? But this is why I call it pervasive intentionality. I think we're thrown in the world, we ascribe intentionality to most of it, certainly when it moves, okay? So that's the movement. Movement is minimum, is the minimum requirement.
But I can detect movement in the midbrain. Do I ascribe intentionality in my midbrain? For instance, if you look at Björn Merker with his idea about zona incerta, then yes, there will be, let's say, a very, for instance, if you detect movement in your midbrain, this will immediately talk to your central gray to activate defensive reactions. Yes, so yes, it is implicitly detected at that level already. But then I'm not explicitly detecting intentionality. I'm just triggering a reflex escape behavior because I saw movement.
But it is a first ascription to the world in some minimal form. It's not full-fledged consciousness if you want. But yes, so the processing of intentionality happens very early in the brain, I would claim. And there I'm with Björn, so Björn has been analyzing children who have these, actually have a minimum neocortex. And these children are severely impaired. But the question is, are they conscious or not? Okay, so Björn makes the claim, Björn Merker, by observing these children very closely, that they actually show rudiments of conscious experience in terms of expressing, let's say, happiness, engagement, social, sort of primitive forms of social interaction. And he attributes that to integrative structures in the brainstem and midbrain level, evolving around zona incerta, central gray, and the superior colliculus. Okay. Of course, this is a speculation, but as far as my proposal goes, I also see this more like an expanding funnel of ascribing intentionality to the world than that it is really only localized at some higher level part of the neocortex, let's say. Okay? But we can find it out later when I'll give you some more evidence. All right? Okay, this is DEC and that's all true. So what's so special about consciousness? So one thing, I know there's a big debate about consciousness. The philosophers have not made that easier by saying, well, we don't need to define it. Thomas Metzinger would say, well, that starts when you wake up, and it sort of goes away when you fall asleep. Okay? And I think we have to do better than that. I think this is not a very satisfying definition. So I will give you a more explicit definition later on. But one thing we can already see about consciousness is that it is this unified experience. It's a unified experience that also evolves over time. It can be this stream of consciousness. So I want to emphasize very much this integrated, unified conscious scene. And then people have already shown, so this goes back to Steve Lorais and others, that then consciousness also seems to have a gradation, different levels, right? We can be fully awake, we can be asleep, we can be in coma. So you can sort of map then awareness versus vigilance. Vigilance is mean, to what extent does my behavior indicate that I'm engaging with the world? And what people have shown then is that these different levels of consciousness all correlate in various ways with dynamics of the brain. So to give you some examples, here we have coma patients. We have MRI scans of their brains, and what is argued here is that in this case coma very much correlates with changes in deep areas, midline structures in the brain, brainstem structures. So that might relate to, let's say, more the vigilance axis in this case of consciousness, as for instance expressed in the reticular formation, which you can see as a general. Yes, please.
How do you measure awareness?
Okay, so how they, in this case, this might be your ability to respond to stimuli in the world or to report stimuli in the world. Like if I wave a light, does your iris change? If I ask you to, if I pose you a question, do you answer or not? Right. So this is always, so far, this was always measured in terms of your ability to react to the world. What's interesting now, Adrian Owen, I wasn't really going to talk about that. Adrian Owen and others have now started to look at characterizing sort of levels of consciousness using fMRI data. And how they do this now is they say, well, what they observed is that there are coma patients, and when you ask them, imagine you play a tennis game, or you might see high activation in motor-related areas, that is very similar to what you might see in age-matched control subjects. Even though these people cannot express themselves in a way, they might be locked in. Okay, so they cannot react in any way to stimuli in the world, and in that sense, they might be declared to be in a coma, while actually they're fully conscious, is now the interpretation, and then the assessment is done by just looking at brain signals. But this is sort of like a new development. Traditionally, this is all done in behavioral terms. Okay? Another important system, this is then illustrated in this paper by Stephen Lorais, which also correlates with states of coma, is the thalamocortical system. So this is very much the interaction, in this case between frontal areas in the cortex and their interaction with the thalamus, which, as you know, is a very central nucleus that is recurrently coupled to the cortex and is largely responsible for linking the neocortex to other brain structures and the periphery. So typical candidates in terms of neural substrate of consciousness often point to the direction of either brainstem areas, very, very primitive centers in the brain, like the reticular formation, or points to the thalamocortical system and associated nuclei. If you go, however, to other structures in the brain, like the cerebellum, which you know now a little bit, people like Beckenstein has shown that if you just do a very simple eyelid conditioning paradigm on coma patients, it works. You can classically condition coma patients in a very standard way that don't show big differences to healthy controls, and you can also correlate that with activity of their cerebellum. So this means there seems to be a dissociation here in brain structure. Some structures is working happily, whether you're conscious or not, and other structures more strongly correlated with these levels of consciousness. Another thing we also know that we can use drugs, which of course none of you has ever done, like ketamine, to also change states of consciousness. Ketamine is a very nasty drug. I don't know if anyone tried Big K on a party, but don't do it. I was a subject in an experiment on psychosis, which you induce with ketamine, and I can tell you it works. I was really psychotic for a while.
The effect wear off.
Huh? Sorry? Huh?
You still haven't recovered.
I know. Well, this was the whole problem. It's irreversible.
It's difficult to know if you really recover. How can you know?
I don't. But so ketamine is basically an antagonist of NMDA receptors, so excitatory signal exchange in the brain. It blocks it in a rather diffuse way. Let's see, not a lot is known as whether this is more regionalized effects or not, but we do know that we can change states of consciousness. In my case, what I experience in my psychosis are things like you think you're dead you're laying dead in the room, or you're in a coma forever, space and time is gone. The world is a very messy place, and it's also filled with this underlying emotional tone of dread. Everything is it's not necessarily acutely scary, but this dread of like, this is the end, it's finished, okay, we're done. All right?
But were you conscious that you were in this state?
Yes. No. This was real. This was reality at that point in time.
You didn't think that was going to finish. You didn't take it.
No, you don't know that. I
You
thought,
were inside.
yes, I was in that experience. I was believing that the room was actually a reflection in my eyeball, and that I was laying there in a coma for a few years, and that I would never wake up. Okay? So, anyway.
You can remember. No?
Exactly.
It's not lost.
But the point is, for anyone who wants to study consciousness, it's an interesting experience, even though it's a very nasty experience. It's really, so stay away from ketamine, it's no good. It works really well on horses, young children, and the elderly. But everybody in between will go psychotic. And the thing is, they lure you into the experiment. Oh no, it's just like LSD, you have a great trip, it's fantastic. But okay, it's not. But the key thing here is we can modulate states of consciousness through drugs whose action we know. We know what they do. Yeah? Now, two approaches have been advanced by two, let's say, giants of biology. So Francis Crick and Jerry Edelman. And Francis Crick, who teamed up with Christoph Koch, was at the Salk Institute in San Diego, where also I met him, and he was also often in the computational neuroscience group there of Terry Sinovsky. He really thought he had it all figured out, so he didn't need to do a lot of explanation. But what they proposed is first a strong link of consciousness and attention, attentional processing, looking at structures like the pulvinar, but also that the scientific path to understand consciousness was the correlation, to find the neural correlate of consciousness. So not necessarily a causal explanation, just let's get the correlations first. And once we have those correlations, then we can see what kind of principles emerge. Jerry Edelman, with whom I worked at the time for 2 years at the Neurosciences Institute, Jerry, who was really an ingenious bastard, I mean, the man was so smart and he knew so much, but then in the meantime, he really had to dominate everything, you know. So it was very difficult to work with, but really smart guy. Also a very, very sort of visionary, romantic person, but still impossible to deal with. If you think I'm difficult, okay, then you ain't seen nothing yet. And Jerry would acknowledge that of himself. I don't think he would consider this very insulting. I mean, he died a year ago. But his proposal on consciousness, look, we have to look at this from a theoretical perspective. We need to build a theory of consciousness to at least, let's say, speculate about causal structure, and then have specific validations of that. Okay? So it's data versus theory, which is still quite a debate in neuroscience. So then what are the core ingredients of consciousness? And then later we come back to the data versus theory speculation. I have no idea how I'm doing time-wise, but I'm sure we have plenty of time left.
You have some time.
I have some time, great. So first, I give you now a quick overview of where we are in the state of the art on the study of consciousness. What are the different ideas that people have been proposing? Okay? It's about 90% complete, let's say. So first, there are a number of authors who emphasize the physically instantiated self. That consciousness, conscious experience, qualia is anchored in the physically instantiated self, as Thomas Metzinger, who also has been a speaker here at BCBT, see this really as the grounding of conscious experience. An example is oh damn, we have this, okay, sorry. Okay, this patient here was described by Peter Brugger. It's really an amazing paper in PNAS. And this lady was born without limbs, right? So everything in gray she just didn't have, all right? And then they would ask her, though, to describe her experience of these limbs. Okay, so here the numbers indicate the strength of her experience of those parts of the body, okay? Where max is 5 or 6 or something like this. So you see that even though she never had these limbs, she does report very distinctly to experience those limbs, right? So this is then just to illustrate that this idea of the embodied self as an anchor to conscious awareness is not completely unreasonable, because apparently it's really like an experiential, a subjective prior to our system. Okay? Even if you don't have certain body parts, you might still experience them. Then the second one is sensory-motor coupling. Courtesy Kevin O'Regan. Kevin has been also speaker at BCBT. We have a great lecture with him, some with some really violent debate. Very nice. And Kevin makes the key point. So Kevin tries to explain the problem of qualia, which is what is it like to really feel a certain state? What it is like to observe, to perceive a certain color? Or in Kevin's example, what it is like to feel a sponge or another kind of material, the cushions here, right? And what Kevin is saying is that, well, the quality of that experience is fully defined by your physical sensory-motor coupling to that object, right? So the sponge, in Kevin's case, is squishy, so you can squeeze it. It has a certain resistance and a certain texture, and it's that physical interaction. It's really the physics of my interaction with the world that now defines and anchors my experience. Then we have the sensory-motor predictions. So that goes back to Gary Haslow, Crush, Björn Merkers, and Barsalou, who very much sees consciousness from the perspective of a Kalman filter. And we can look at this example to illustrate what this would mean. Can we have some sound? So a little face recognition experiment.
What is the...
Nice to meet you, Slash. I know you. You are networks. I know you. You are Slash. I know you. You are networks.
So here we're testing a model of the visual processing system in the mammalian brain, and to use it for face recognition. But the problem that you have here, so here's the robot looking at the world during these experiments, and you see there's lots of motion, right? We have eye movements, the robot might move itself. And what Björn Merker is proposing is why I maintain the conscious scene, which is like a summary of my experience, is to counteract the noise in my real sensor data. So Björn's point is, look, I move through the world, I walk through the world, and even though I have a very stable gait, there will be some bobbing of the head, okay? The sensor signals that come in through my eyes, even though my eyes try to stabilize, will never be perfectly aligned at sort of the single photoreceptor level, so I have to compensate for this noise. And what Björn is now saying is I predict future states of the world to counteract this noise. And then in Björn's case, in his proposal, the conscious scene is exactly, its role is to help you do that. Now there's another variation on the predictive model of consciousness.
Hi.
She just shocked the robot. I hope you saw that.
No voy a responder.
Oh, we don't translate it, okay.
Haz la corriente más baja. Por favor. Ahí. Para, por favor. No quiero continuar. Quiero que esto se acabe ya.
Okay. So this is a robot version of the famous Milgram obedience experiment, where we give people this box. I mean, Maria and Vicky have been running these experiments. And what you see here is that some people walked out of the experiment because they really couldn't continue anymore giving shocks to the robot. Okay? And we also then show in our analysis what we manipulated were, let's say, the anthropomorphic features of the robot. Does the robot look at you or not? Is it smiling or not? Does it have facial expressions and so on? And we show that it has a direct impact on the duration of the shocks that people want to give to the robot, or how willing they are to actually give shocks to the robot. Now, the point here is that this pertains to another theory that relates to prediction in consciousness. It goes back to Mike Graziano, who was here at our Living Machines workshop on robot selves. And basically what he's saying is, look, consciousness is the attribution of awareness to other agents to start with. Right? So we see also in our Milgram robot experiment, people are apparently attributing certain properties to this robot, that they can hurt it. And they don't want to do that, so they stop the experiment. But then, what Graziano is, so consciousness allows me to make predictions on what you care about, what you are paying attention to, what you're looking at. So I could say, aha, this monkey really cares about the banana. Or Tony really cares about the beer that I want to drink. Okay, it's always like that. But then, the second step in this process is that now we have managed in evolution, by magical means, because Mike doesn't explain that, to make that same attribution to ourselves. So now my consciousness is a self-awareness of what I am paying attention to. Okay, so the prediction mechanism I first applied to Aldo to check out what he's paying attention to, I now apply to myself. And now I'm self-aware. You want to make a noise about that, Tony? Because you're fondling the microphone.
I think you are misrepresenting his position, and also Kevin, both of them don't want to have consciousness as a mechanism. They want to explain consciousness away. They want to say that consciousness is a label that we use for something which we can actually explain in simpler terms. So Graziano is saying that there's a story I tell about other people and why they do things, and then I can use the same mental model to tell a story about myself, and that's what we're labeling as
No,
consciousness.
it's more specific than that, Tony. It's not just telling stories.
But he is making the strong claim that there isn't anything special about consciousness.
Wait, I do agree with you that they explain it away.
Yeah.
Okay, but I didn't want to push that point too hard to prevent a little bit too much of a polemic at this stage. I just wanted to get to the core of their idea, and I think the core of Mike's idea here is this attribution of attention to you and awareness in the form of attention, and then subsequently to apply that exact same description to myself. Right? So that means now what we formerly called consciousness has now become an attentional awareness, if you want. That's it. Okay? And in Kevin's case, Kevin is getting less hardcore at times. He's waving a little bit there. But the key thing about Kevin's position is to say, well, qualia is nothing magical. It sits in your physical interaction with the world. Right? This is the key point I wanted to get across. Right? But indeed, for Kevin, consciousness as such is just a word and we don't need to worry about it. Yeah? Okay. More core ingredients. Differentiation, integration. We'll go back to Edelman, Tononi. So what Jerry Edelman and Giulio Tononi proposed, because Giulio worked with Jerry for a long time, also when I was there, is that every conscious scene is differentiated. So that means you can look at the different pictures. I can look at the scene here, the room. I can have a dream. So the conscious scene is almost infinitely variable. Right? We can think of a pink polar bear dancing on an egg, floating in an X-ray machine. It doesn't matter. It can be anything, right? So it is incredibly differentiated. But every one conscious scene we have, like Tony typing away on his phone, is highly integrated. All the pieces fit together. It's coherent, right? So this is the key thing they want to explain. And then Giulio has done this now, first via models of the thalamocortical system, and now also using a method of quantification. So what comes out of this now is that Giulio has, where Jerry Edelman tried to understand this integration, differentiation from a theoretical perspective, I'll get back to later, Giulio, and this is now very much the state of the art if you want, he said, no, but let's just quantify this. So that's when Giulio Tononi has now moved from the theory perspective to the data perspective. And also if you saw Stan de Haan's talk last week, he deals very much with classifiers. He uses machine learning techniques to classify MEG states under various conditions of consciousness to just extract now correlates. To say, oh, I have different predictors of varying states of consciousness when, for instance, you're being primed while it was biasing your decision, or you were primed by a subconscious stimulus that did not bias your decision. So Giulio now proposes phi measure, and the concept of phi is essentially to say, well, consciousness is basically telling you something about the informational space in which you exist. And high levels of consciousness allow you to maintain a highly differentiated set of information in which you have different sub-components that are highly integrated, right? So I have within integration for every scene, if you want. So I have subsets of information that is tightly interlinked. And then I have a large set of these that are infinitely segregated. And then he quantifies this using informational measures, starting with mutual information, and this has advanced further to just say, okay, but then how can I quantify in bits how much of these differentiated sets of integrated information I have in my brain? So for that he developed this phi measure, and what we have done now, so basically what Giulio now says, well, if I now apply my information theoretic measure phi to any object, it is just the value you get for this ability to integrate subsets and segregate across them. This is your consciousness index. Okay, so the better your ability to build these subsets and segregate them, the higher your consciousness. But this now has an interesting implication, because that means every atom has a minimal level of this kind of integration and segregation. So basically, but what we have done now is we have compared the phi measure versus this variance measure I earlier told you about. So here in green, we have again our monkey decision-making task, and we take our neurons that we analyze. You saw VarCE earlier for the onset and the action initiation, and now we plot this consciousness measure phi. We calculate phi from the same set of neurons. Okay. Yes.
So can I get a few more details on how you get phi? So is that continuous data? Or
It's
I mean, for this particular experiment.
oh, for this we just bin the data, and then for every bin you calculate the informational content of that set of neurons. So how strongly are they coupled together as one set, or how much are they segregated? How much are they sort of randomly related?
So you get the firing rates and you bin them?
Exactly. So they're binned, and then in those bins you try to see, if I now look at the firing rate within my bin, across this whole set of neurons, how much of these are co-varying and how much are decorrelated. Okay, and this is essentially your measure of phi, of the informational content in that set of neural activities, without making any commitments what this might mean. But it's just, let's say, the covariant subset in the spikes that you have. Okay? But what you see here, and this is maybe not very surprising, is that if whether you measure this variance measure that we looked at earlier, or our information theoretic measure, they're anti-correlated. So, and here it's sort of panned out for the different trials that we have. Remember, go-go trials, we would have, okay, this is mislabeled. We would have lower variance than in the stop-go trials. So it looks like phi and variance is strongly correlated. And why do I play this game? Why is this informative? Well, we haven't really discussed the limit experiment in detail yet, okay? But what we can wonder about is if the monkey makes the decision, while the monkey makes the decision, it's not conscious of that process all the while. Consciousness might emerge later in the trial, after you initiated the action, or in the later part of the trial. But it's unreasonable, it's not plausible to assume that really from the stimulus onset until the completion of the action, the monkey is aware of exactly that specific part of its decision-making process. So that would mean if consciousness is only kicking in with respect to the task late, you would expect that your phi, your consciousness-specific information measure, would reflect that in a way that is more specific than a measure that is only trying to tell you something about the neural dynamics. And this is not really the case. So with that, we cannot necessarily fully reject phi as a measure, but what I try to say with that, we should be careful using these information theoretic measures as expressing something that we call equivalent to consciousness. Maybe they're not sensitive enough to tell us much about it. Okay, so this is... Now the last one is the global workspace. It's also Stan DeHaan, who was here last week, talked about the global workspace. It goes back to Barney Bars, who basically proposed a theory in the 80s where you say, well, maybe consciousness is all about broadcasting information. If you think about the brain like this parallel operating machine in which many pieces of information are being considered and integrated, how do I have all these different processes actually combine their information together? How do I have them exchange information, and how do I make sure that this information exchange is specific? So he called it the global workspace. I have my processors here, my different processors, and let's say this one here with the bars on it has now my relevant information about my task, and it puts it on a bus, if you want, which allows it to communicate that piece of information via the global workspace to the other processors that might need it. Okay? So this is from a more recent paper by Stan DeHaan and other people, where they also model this global workspace. So where you basically look, this is my cortical network, the neocortex. There are many nodes which are now considered processors that are linked together, and those that are what they call ignited. So ignition might be signaled by a strong transient response in the activity of such a node. So here are the different nodes that might respond to different pieces of sensory information. But here you see the router. Okay, there's a router at work in the system that sort of via this global workspace allows now processors to work together. It's It's a bit of a parallel computer metaphor, if you want. Okay? But that means the whole process of consciousness plays out in cortex and is closely tied to decision-making or executive control. Jerry Edelman and Judith Zanoni already had an earlier concept, or a correlated concept, on that which they called the dynamic core, where it was actually the thalamocortical system that was providing this kind of global workspace that they called the dynamic core, that would sort of dynamically link sub-processes in neocortex together in a task-oriented way. So it's all about selectivity now in cortical processing. Okay? So, okay, I can call this, to summarize it, I call this the GP model, because it's about grounding in the body, it's inactive in the world, it's predictive, and it's experience dependent, but this is just labels, doesn't matter. So what are other properties of consciousness we should worry about? Well, the Libet experiment was already mentioned by several of our speakers, and it was really very curious, because in this case humans had to watch a clock, and they just were told, look, whenever you feel like it, push a button, but please report to me when you want to move, or for other subjects, please report to me when you initiate your movement. And then we can start to measure those times and see how they line up with physiological signals of decision making. And what Libet measured was the lateralized or the readiness potential basically across the motor cortex. He was just looking at, okay, we assume that when I'm going to push a button, activation will build up in my motor cortex, which should correlate with that decision process. And then what came out is that the so-called readiness potential already starts to build up significantly before humans start to report on their decision-making process, in the range of 300 to 500 milliseconds. And there have been different variations on this experiment. It's been replicated by a number of people. What's important about this is that, okay, for some reason the brain already knows what you're going to do before you're aware of it. This is not necessarily a surprise. However, people made quite a story out of it, because here we have this unified scene that evolves over time, but it runs delayed to real-time operation, which seems curious. And that's why, let me see, that's why people like Dan Dennett, for instance, also would find evidence in that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. It's really something that is not causally related to our action. So it is like a little, that's what Steve Pinker called an evolutionary cheesecake, right? Something just a little extra, but it has no real causal role to play in our behavior. And another interpretation came from Dan Wagner and others, who actually wrote a really nice book called The Illusion of Conscious Will, where he summarizes a lot of this literature, where he's saying, well, look, you know, there is this unconscious causation of action, a causal pathway that is fully unconscious, and then there's maybe a causal experience to that, but also this is again set in motion through an unconscious process, and the two are not necessarily linked. So the conscious experience of your free will is not necessarily related to the actual causation of your action, and there's a lot of psychological experimentation behind that. So this now put in doubt free will. Because now the conclusion is, okay, modern science tells us free will is an illusion, which, as you can imagine, would have, of course, have main consequences in our society, in our legal system. And legal systems are basically based on the sense of agency and free will. So if you now say free will doesn't exist, how are we going to deal with that? So, and we're going to salvage free will. So how can we actually now consider free will, explain free will in a universe that is deterministic, and also what science wants us to believe? So this is the universe that science wants us to believe in, where zombies with no free will. Tony, do zombies have free will? No, they can't have free will, no. Right? Exactly. So, so how can we consider then the agent as the prime mover of action, given now this evidence that shows us that free will is actually not playing a role? Okay? This also explains why in specs we have everyone in big spaces, so we will not destroy their illusion of free will. So we already had seen the emergence of who, and my claim now is that, even though there's also some literature behind that, but I'm not summarizing it here. To solve H5W, as I described to you earlier, I must be able to do mind reading. I must be able to make predictions about your hidden states, and there are many of you out there. And I'm not sure which of you is going to reenact Friday the 13th. Okay, so we have to track all of these agents. And I must track your intentions, so that means I have to virtualize my environment. I have to parallelize my environment. The world is filled with agents. I have to in parallel track them, but I can only track them by virtualizing these agents. I'm tracking you in terms of states I just infer, that I ascribe to you. And they can be completely wrong. They're not really there, they're not physically anchored. They're just inferred states. This is my only solution to deal with assessing and adjusting my behavior to a world that's filled with intention and other agents. So now, what does it mean to parallelize and virtualize? I will just give you an example. Okay, what kind of problems this will create if you parallelize. Let's just look at parallelization. This is a rendering of a neuroprosthetic chip we built for the cerebellum. Okay, this was actually implanted in the rat, and we could replace the eye blink conditioning circuit in an inactivated cerebellar cortex through our chip, but just piping the information from the pons and inferior olive straight into our device and stimulating the deep nucleus. So we could completely bypass the cerebellar learning loop. But now in the human cerebellum, we have about 15 million identified parallel loops. If I would try to emulate this set of parallel loops with my chip, I would have a stack of chips of about 150 kilometers. Okay? So a lot of them. So this is illustrating a next problem I have when I parallelize. Because how do I do credit assignment in this case? So why is credit assignment a problem? First, it is a problem with respect to the scale at which I have to ascribe states to my controllers. But I have to monitor states of the world that are not conveyed to me in direct sensory signals, right? So whether I misbehave to Tony, right, he will tell me that later, because he's very British and never tell you in your face, right? He'll tell you a week later, like, oh, I thought what you told me a week ago was not so polite, right? And that means they're really upset with you, okay? So again, that norm, that learning cue I'm now getting is really hidden in the signal, in the physical signal. Right? It's not the same as getting a shock on my orbit when I'm being classically conditioned, right? So if I have a cerebellum and I get my shock on the orbit or my air puff feeding into my inferior olive, that's a very clear reinforcement signal that directly corresponds to a state of the world. Right? But if Tony says, well, I thought you weren't so polite, right? This is not a direct sensory signal feeding into my inferior olive. So how do I now optimize, how do I interpret these indirect signals as a norm with which I have to optimize my parallel controllers? So this is the problem we got to solve. And that's what consciousness does for you, in my opinion. So that means, whereas my behavior is under real-time control, unconscious and parallel, also with the social world. So if I say the wrong thing, it's all unconscious, right? That's just the ketamine speaking. But now to optimize, to extract these hidden norms, like, oh, Paul, you were not so polite to me a week ago, I need to serialize. I have to interpret. I have to again place this into a serialized scheme. That, oh, I, as one agent, was dealing with Tony as another agent. And there was a very linear progression of some interaction that now has a certain value. And my parallel controllers that make me say all these bad things about Britishers and alcohol consumption should be toned down. All right? So the big problem here is I have to extract these hidden states, including the hidden norms. Like Rochard was also here in our workshop, and he's a developmental psychologist, right? And the point he's making, which I think directly pertains to this, is that we should not think about humans as being adjusted to a physical world. From the moment we're born, we are social animals. From the moment we're born, we try to just tune in to these hidden norms of our culture, of our social environment. And this is not a shock to your orbit. These are states you must infer. So how do you do that in an unambiguous way? Because if you don't infer those values unambiguously, you're screwed. You cannot optimize your parallel real-time controllers anymore. So what happens here now, I act in real time. My conscious scene is again sequentializing my full interaction with the world to extract norms. It is all about valuation. And these values allow me now to adjust my parallel behavioral control so that in the future I can be nicer to Tony. Okay? So that means this delay we have in the conscious scene is not a bug, it's a feature. Because I'm a monitoring system. So I first have to act in real time, subsequently I monitor, I extract my norms. I optimize my parallel real-time control. So it has to proceed as a dual system arranged in real time. So let's now look at a prediction. One prediction this makes is that the conscious scene can be dynamically coupled or uncoupled from real-time control. Okay, that is not a monolithic system. It's a monitoring system that in a task-dependent way will couple itself to a certain form of processing or detach. Okay, so let's see if we can test this hypothesis in a plausible way. So we have our attention model that developed with Zen and Matthews, and also Richard, sleeping in the back, has been working on that, doing the psychophysics. And there the basic idea is essentially how can I merge feed-forward and top-down attention? Right? Because the point is, Tony likes beer, but he wasn't born liking beer. He likes the Beatles. He wasn't born liking the Beatles. But still, he can seek out stimuli in the world that match those top-down preferences. Right? So how is that done? How do we modulate attention using these kind of more cognitive expectations? So the whole idea of the validation gate that we developed actually comes from radar control, and the concept is very simple. Imagine I'm just tracking this object here, and this object is generating sense data. So I'm observing what I'm getting from this object. That might be an airplane, but it can also be Aldo running through the room in his speedos. I get data, I get observations. I cluster these observations, and I'm clustering these observations relative to some prediction I might make about the motion of these objects. And essentially, I can put a threshold around that clustering process that tells me, okay, what should be the minimum distance at which I assume that data is reliable? If I predict that the yellow tennis ball is moving at a certain speed in a certain direction, I can already predict, okay, if I see yellow in a certain region a bit in front of where it is now, probably I don't have to worry about it. This is where I expect it to be. However, if data points now fall outside of that region, outside of what you can call your validation gate or anticipatory field, that's when I should worry. Because now I have something new, I have an error. And I allocate resources, I pay attention, I look. Okay? So this validation gate defines the region of data that you consider reliable within or novel or an error outside. Okay? So if you follow that process, then there are two attention-generating signals. Data points falling outside your anticipatory fields or anticipatory fields overlapping, because now you have ambiguity that you have to resolve. So we tested this idea also in our robot models, and we implemented this also in XIM for people tracking and so on. But we also wanted to see whether humans really follow this process. Do validation gates describe human visual processing and attention allocation accurately? So we have a simple task here. People sit on this chin rest. They look at these moving circles, and they move in certain directions. But once in a while, one of these circles displaces, as you see here, right? It jumps. Now, we track the eye movements of the subject, and we also ask them to push the button when they see a displacement. And we take the button push as an operant expression of a conscious state, that people then consciously detected. They were conscious of this displacement. And the thing that we vary here is cognitive load. Remember, my question now is, if my conscious scene is a monitoring system, then I must be able to dynamically allocate that to different tasks, right? This is the prediction. So can I decouple the two? So what we do, we give people a cognitive load, and we vary the cognitive load. This might be recite the alphabet backwards, recite it backwards, skipping 3 letters at a time. You have different, or end-back tasks, like you show people stimuli and asking which one did you see 5 trials ago.
Could you just have more circles?
For cognitive load?
Yeah.
No, that would just make the visual task more complex. Cognitive load is really supposed to be a fully separate, disconnected task that is loading your working memory. Okay? So this is the task. So once in a while, one of these things will jump. So then what we do is reverse correlation on the, so that means now we have events, like we have eye movements, fast or slow, we have button presses, and then we can say, okay, what event in the data display correlated with that action? So from there you can now build up a psychophysical kernel that says, well, within this range in the input space, the visual input space, events will or will not trigger that action. So here we have the reaction times for the different tasks, here for the conscious detections. For the low cognitive load task and the high cognitive load task, you see reaction time in milliseconds goes up when the cognitive load goes up, which is an expected effect, but it shows you that the cognitive load task is really pushing the working memory. It's considered like a separate task, makes it more difficult. And then here we see the number of displacements that are being detected as cognitive load goes up. This is with the button presses, and you see this goes down with cognitive load. So just the method seems to be having the effect that we want it to have. Then here we have the saccade vectors, and we see we have a number of saccades here, the direction of the displacement, and then also you have a whole bunch of saccades that go away from the displacement. This is the central vectors, all normalized. So we have normalized this display. 0, the direction 0 is the displacement direction, and then all displacements have been normalized to that axis. So what you see here, that most saccades are going in a direction, in this case. If you look at the overall distribution of saccades, you have the highest impact in saccades towards the displacement. So that means also the eye tracking is sort of doing what it's supposed to do. And on top of it, what you see here is a bimodal distribution of the eye movements, both fast eye movements and slower eye movements, which seem to, or which are considered to be echoes of different control, saccade control systems in the brain. So then here we have the conscious detections of the saccades. So here we have the detections by eye movements of the early and the late saccades with low cognitive load. Here we have the same for medium cognitive load and higher cognitive load. So you see that actually in the terms of the detected proportion, the detected displacements with the saccades, there's not a very big impact of the cognitive load task. Right? So your eyes keep on sort of jumping after these targets independent of how much cognitive load you have. But now if you look at the number of saccades that are also followed by a button press, so I'm now conscious of the displacement, you see that there, that proportion really goes down with your cognitive load significantly as compared to the low cognitive load case. Okay? So you see that in the late saccades, we have the number of late saccades followed by a button press in the low cognitive load condition is very high, and that proportion goes down if you have the high cognitive load case. Okay, so this is suggesting that indeed the number of button presses, number of conscious detections start to go down as cognitive load goes up. which for us is then suggesting that we're decoupling the conscious process of monitoring from the automatic tracking of the stimuli. Now if you look at the psychophysical kernels, there's one display of them. So here you look at the button press kernels, like what are the detected events in terms of the validation gates that we get at low cognitive load to high cognitive load. You see a strong shift, an elongation of these along the movement direction here. That basically means that under high cognitive load, the button presses become more insensitive to displacements. In other words, you could interpret this as the conscious monitoring system saying, look, I'm busy with this cognitive load task, I have to recite the alphabet backwards, skipping 5 letters at a time, just don't bother me with these displacements. Okay, so it suggests a dissociation of conscious processing expressed in the button presses and the more automated processing via the eye movements. So this suggests, at least in this experiment, that we can dynamically decouple a conscious process, a conscious monitoring process, from an ongoing tracking task, dependent on a secondary task, which in this case is the cognitive load task. Right? So this would, one of the predictions of the model, or the story on consciousness as a monitoring system for following the hidden states of the world, is that consciousness can be dynamically allocated or deallocated from a task. And this is then a first step to show that in the context of a very well-defined psychophysical task. So how does this salvage free will? Well, basically what this means is that I can will myself, I can be consciously aware of the norms that I'm applying to my parallel real-time controllers to be better in the future. So that means I can will myself to become a faster cyclist by saying I'm going to train more. So that means I think the big mistake in the free will discussion has been, since Descartes, is that we wanted to think about free will as controlling the real-time operation of the agent. And that's, I think, not happening. But what we can think about is free will as being consciously aware of the values I'm imposing on my real-time control. So free will allows us to be consciously aware of how we will ourselves into the future, if you want. And there, as a construct, it has a useful role to play. So, addressing the hard problem of consciousness. Okay. Okay. Okay, I'll show you how we're going to do that. We end with this little video. Is Alberto here? Yeah. This is going to go in Alberto's video diary. Here we have the ICAP robot. So this is a little bit where the modeling has to go. You see, Alberto really feels very sorry for the ICAP. Poor robot. It is just not experiencing anything. But now we're going to link it up to the human connectome. And we already have done this. So this is just a sketch of how I think we're going to model the conscious machine. Right? I gave you a story how this works. I also have told you how this, it's a monitoring system that is tuned to our interaction with the unobservable parts of the world we have to survive in. How are we going to model that? Well, this requires large-scale models. We want these models to reflect our best understanding of the brain, the human brain, which right now an example is the connectome. So I want to see a convergence of the tools we use to analyze human brain and the tools that we use to simulate it. Because in the end, the way we're going to analyze simulated brains or real brains, these tools are going to be largely overlapping. Okay, so this is where we're going to go, then linking BrainCube to the ICAP robot to understand consciousness. And all of you are exposed to some of you also working on aspects of that adventure here. But I really want us to think more clearly about how we bring together these large-scale data sets on the human brain and the large-scale models that we have to build for that to understand and salvage free will. So, DEC gives a new function, or gives a function to consciousness, right? It is, you serialize the interaction with the world to extract norms to optimize parallel control, okay? And in this way, it again gives a role for free will as willing us to be better in the future, which certainly all students should take to heart, because for me it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the talk. So throughout your talk, you have mentioned a few times, the few core ingredients of consciousness. So if you have those ingredients, does it matter what substrate the conscious processor, quote, is implemented in?
Well, this is the question of multi-instantiation, right? So could we build a conscious machine that is based on principles very different from the brain, right? This is essentially what you're after.
Pretty much.
And multi-instantiation is an issue. However, I think that what you're going to find is that if you answer all the constraints, that means you must be embodied, act in real time, be autonomous, keep the controller alive autonomously, so you cannot just plug in all the time to a wall socket and so on. I predict that you're going to converge on a set of design principles that will be very, very close to what brains look like. Okay, so yes, in theory, yes. However, I think the design principles will start to converge to a very a common set of principles underlying consciousness.
Anyone else?
But they're all convinced, Tony.
Okay, well, I'll have a go at you because nobody wants to. So the consciousness is an integrating, serializing, monitoring system that helps you choose your future actions. So
not choose.
Oh, helps you decide.
No, it optimizes.
It helps shape.
It shapes your parallel control.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
real-time control.
I think the brain has that kind of system in it.
Yes, absolutely. That's why it's conscious.
But what the problem that I have with this is that really what you're saying is what people have been saying in cognitive psychology for at least 60 years. You can look at people like Alan Baddeley, talking about a central executive system. You can look at people like James Anderson, Isaac Starr. There was serializing. So, and all of these ideas have precedence in cognitive psychology. Now, we have this new field of consciousness science, which wants to take classical cognitive psychology and relabel it all as being about consciousness. But your account and all these other accounts that you describe don't address the real aspect of consciousness, which is the one which is most immediate and important to people, which is subjectivity. You don't explain subjectivity. You explain things that the brain does, but we could do all those and not have subjectivity, and this is what Daniel Dennett says, and I think he's right, that you could have a zombie that does all these things and has no subjectivity. There's no way other than correlation that you can claim that what you say gives rise to an experience of subjectivity. So, and for that reason, I think that this whole new science of consciousness is a bit of a con trick. It's a way of getting cognitive psychology funded, which is great, because I love cognitive psychology, but it's not getting us any closer to an explanation of subjectivity, probably because subjectivity is something that cannot be explained. In the sense that Dan Dennett, or that the explanation is just that it's there, that it's something that happens when brains do their stuff. They experience subjectivity.
Yeah, but you're challenging me on two fronts, right? On the one hand, you're saying it's old news, and the other hand, you're saying you're not solving the real problem, which is subjectivity.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So you're wrong on both counts. Okay. So the point is, indeed, look, in psychology, forever there's a discussion going on, and between parallel or sequential models of information processing, right? This is a fight that goes on forever, and people have not been able to settle this. Okay, so if you look at DAC and its contextual layer, how it does also sequential goal and problem solving, it actually is a parallel system that sequentializes its outputs through action selection. Okay, so in that sense, to just the key statement about this DAC theory and consciousness is not to say, oh, we are sequentializing something. That's not the point. It makes a more specific point. It says you are sequentializing your interaction with this world that's filled with intentions And why do you have to do that? Because you have to simulate all these intentional agents. This is happening in parallel. So the specific statement that DEC is making is that the monitoring that consciousness performs is there by virtue of the parallel real-time control. That's really giving you a very explicit statement on how parallel control and sequential control has to work together. And it gives you a concrete set of statements on that are testable, as I showed with the psychophysics.
Well, I think I'm not saying that there isn't a good story here, and I think it's in some senses a more complete story than other stories. But all the elements of the story are
not all of them
already existed.
Yeah, but look, you cannot judge a theory by saying, "Oh, it's written in English." I know English.
Well, for example,
in Sanskrit now?
this task the latest task that you're describing, it's really a classical cognitive psychology task, where you take a monitoring challenge, a vigilance task, and then you vary the cognitive load, a sort of classical dual task paradigm from cognitive psychology. But then, and that's fine, and you probably discover some new things with the version of the task that you're doing. But then to label it as consciousness rather than being simply vigilance, awareness, all these other words, I don't think really adds anything. I don't think you've said anything that wasn't a theory of how the cognitive apparatus is working, rather than specifically how a conscious brain is working.
No, I don't think that's true. That's really not true, Tony.
But you haven't addressed the subjectivity point.
Now wait, you challenge me on one thing and I cannot answer. Yeah. Okay. No, but Tony, the point is, look, I see your point, and we should indeed be very, look, it's a typical thing that happens in neuroscience. Like we ride this wave of amnesia, right? And we just start to talk about stuff that was in the literature 5 years ago, and nobody remembers because these young people just read Facebook all the time. So it's new, right? It's a new thing. So yes, I agree, we have to pay attention to our historical roots, but I think we're doing that, okay? And I don't think that the challenge, I think there are dual process theories, there are parallel sequential kind of debates going on, but I think we also find a resolution in those debates as opposed to rejecting either of these two camps. I think Dan Dennett is completely wrong, and I think he suffers from scientism. That means whatever I cannot imagine with my limited mind to be explained in reductionist terms doesn't exist. I think it's the most naive pseudo-scientific intuition you can imagine, which suits a philosopher, but that's probably why he's not a scientist. So we don't need to talk about Dennett. I think he's not helping in this debate, as most of the philosophers actually, because they don't make testable predictions, which we do. Moreover, if we have constructs we don't understand, like free will, consciousness, even soul, we don't have to reject them offhand because they don't sound sciencey enough. So now about subjectivity. Subjectivity is solved, okay? You just refuse to see the answer because you're reading too much Dennett, okay? So what DEC is saying, and in that sense DEC is also unique, all right, because it's not taking a polarized position. Everything is anchored in this column of processing that is self. I am interpreting the world and also my actions always in reference to the self, both at the level of my physical needs, like oxygen, to my abstract goals, like convince Tony I'm right. Okay? So this self gives you the subjectivity of conscious experience. And that is how we will model that. So is there subjective experience? Yes, that is the anchoring of my sequentialized consciousness buffer with respect to the self as expressed at different levels of organization. Now you're going to tell me, oh, but that doesn't explain subjectivity. But then I think we also have to be clear about what do we expect from a scientific explanation of subjectivity, because we're not going to ask the physicist to give an explanation why the chair is actually a chair. We don't expect that from them. It doesn't mean that physics is not a science because it just cannot explain why the chair looks like a chair, right? Even though we could say these are physical properties of the universe. So I think to use like, oh, you haven't explained subjectivity to my liking, because you don't give me criteria for that, except saying it might never be explained, it's not explainable, I don't think it's good enough. Because what I do give you is I gave you function of consciousness, I give you an anchoring of the conscious scene in the self, which I give you as a segue into understanding the subjectivity of experience. Will this go all the way to the level of all aspects of subjectivity? That then is also an experimental question. And this is something we just have to test by building our conscious robot.
Okay, I think that's a good point to stop, and we can all interrogate Paul further over the next few days. Thanks very much to today's speaker.
Sure.